I actually feel prepared for quicksand. That was something we talked about a lot as kids.
I love the conversations that it creates when you're forced in a situation where there's nothing you can do to make it go faster or slower, and you just have to be there together.
And what we see is Joel begins to break down in this episode, but we begin to see this human connection that begins to emerge from this.
I think it also alludes to the fact that there's what we perceive someone's lived experience to be and the reality of their lived experience.
That, to me, was my bloaters at the gravel moment.
There's a layer of communication and forgiveness that needs to be necessary there because you're asking them to force you to do something that you're naturally not going to do.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of our Last of Us Season 1 TV series recap as we prepare for Season 2 of The Last of Us releasing in April. Today we're talking about Episode 4, which is called Please Hold to My Hand. And I know this because we are in take 2 of this. We did take 1 and I flubbed the intro and I flubbed the title of the episode because it just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it, Evan? Please hold to my hand.
It feels like there's some words missing there, and I think I just count myself very fortunate that it was you who was doing the intro for this episode and not myself. So better him than me, everyone.
But here's the thing. This episode title actually has some meaning because I flubbed it bad, and then in between takes, we went to the Google, right? As the elder millennials call it.
We said, "Oh, Google,
answer
us the answers.
Answer our cries." And it turns out it's called this in this nonsensical, grammatically odd way, "Please hold to my hand," because it's referencing the Hank Williams song. Hank Williams, "Alone and Forsaken." And some of the lyrics in this, and this is actually pretty pertinent to the theme of the episode. So as we get into it, this is the final 3 lines of this song. It says, "Alone and forsaken by fate and by man. Oh Lord, if you hear me, please hold to my hand. Oh, please understand." Now, this song is played during this particular sequence in the game, and so it's an interesting subtle nod from the show to the game. I didn't know that, so thank you, Fate and Man, for giving us this flubbed intro so that we could learn these things. Right?
And our ever-present quest for knowledge and understanding.
Always learning, always be learning. That's what I say.
Well, Ellie starts this episode, and I don't know if she's learning or playing or fantasizing, but she has this gun that she has found that was Frank's that she's taken, and she is pointing it, and we just see a shot of Ellie, and it's kind of focused on her face. The gun is a little bit out of focus, but we're kind of focused there, and she just keeps going, pew, pew.
As one does.
Pew, as one does. The pew-pew noise that we all did as kids, and she is, I think, in some ways practicing, in some ways preparing herself, and in some ways just using her imagination. And
she found a gun.
She found a gun.
She's imagining it. I mean, right?
It could have just been a gun-shaped stick. Now this happens to just be an actual gun, but we know that it won't be too long before that gun needs to be fired as they start their trip across the country. So this episode opens and they kind of have to get some supplies. And so we see Ellie practicing with her gun, and then we see a bunch of wrecked cars. Ellie says that she wants to see a tank and has more curiosities about the world, and Joel's kind of trying to explain things to her. But when it comes to gathering supplies and siphoning gas, have you ever tried to siphon gas?
Absolutely not. I would vomit. I have a really terrible and sensitive gag reflex.
Oh, no. Okay, so no gasoline for you. So in a survival scenario, you're going to have somebody who could do that for you.
I nearly vomit when I'm taking the trash out, so I think siphoning gas would be the end of me.
Oh, gosh. Well, yeah, I think it's something that I liked to imagine when I was younger. I was like, oh yeah, in an apocalypse scenario, I could siphon some gas. Or if I fell off a cliff and I was hanging by my fingernails, then I'd be able to pull myself up. Or if I got stuck in quicksand, of course, you just figure it out. Well, as I get older, I'm like, I never want to have to do that. I do not want to have to siphon gas. I pray that I'm never dangling off a cliff. And Lord, if I ever encounter some quicksand, I am out of here.
I actually feel prepared for quicksand. That was something we talked about a lot as kids. So
it was. I asked a group of students, college students, one time. I said, "What is something that you expected to encounter more in life that you didn't?" And they said a lot of really thoughtful things. They said, "Oh man, I think I expected that school would be a little more structured, or I thought that life would be a little easier." And one near the end just goes, "Oh, it's quicksand." I thought,
I love
based
that
on
kid.
Cartoons and TV shows, that there would be a lot more quicksand.
It's an ever-present problem as a child. But
yeah, then there was. And so that was his response. It was hilarious.
Yeah.
So as they get into the car, they start driving across the country and they listen to the radio. They're talking about things. But this kind of brings us to this first moment where they're kind of stuck in the car together. Now, Ellie probably hasn't been stuck in a car with someone before, but Joel has. So that's a little bit of a juxtaposition on what their experience are and what they're trying to get out of this car trip. But you and I share pretty diametrically opposed views on car trips, conversations, and being trapped together. And we see this mirrored with Joel and Ellie. I don't think they're mirroring. I think they're mirroring us. We're not mirroring them here. So you don't love to talk in cars. No. I never stop talking in cars.
Or
how do we survive together?
I mean, it's either way.
How do we survive together? And what is it about that windshield time that you dislike? And I'll talk about what I like about it and why I think it's so important for the modern human experience.
I don't know, man. Like I from the second I get into a car to the second I'll leave it, I hate everything about it. It's just like I'm getting from point A to point B. Like, let's just do it. I just hate it.
Well, some of you may be like Wade, and I view what I call windshield time, and a lot of others do as well, as such an important part of getting to know people and family trips and so many memories and conversations. The way that you can talk and have to talk about things when you're forced in a situation together, I think is really different. Now, for you, it sounds like that feels like torment. Is it just the travel itself? Like if we were having a conversation somewhere else, you just don't feel like that you can't leave it if you don't like the way it's going, or...
I don't really know. I think the driving and the traveling, I'm just like, we could be in a restaurant, we could be in a coffee shop, sitting on a couch, something like that. There's nothing super comfortable about just like traveling, like in a car or whatever. So I just don't like it.
I love the conversations that it creates when you're forced in a situation where there's nothing you can do to make it go faster or slower, and you just have to be there together. Now, I drive a lot of people crazy, I think.
Well, I was about to ask, like, how do you have good conversations in a car? Because I'm very much like Joel. I'm like knuckling the driving, the steering wheel, and I'm just like, let's just go and like stop, just read your pun book, go over there. Like, how do you make it more livable?
I'm realizing more and more how we really are in this scenario, just exactly like Joel and Ellie. As we rode in the car, we rode in the car for like an hour or so the other day, and things are making more sense to me here. Yeah, things are making more sense. So I think it forces you to be creative to connect with people. The kinds of things that you talk about, the questions that you ask. You know, sometimes you get into like the would you rathers. It can kind of feel like one big get to know you game sometimes, which now I'm realizing is another layer of your nightmare.
I'm trapped in a cage playing icebreakers.
It's just a neat thing that can happen. One of my favorite things that happens on car trips is when you have multiple people and like one person's asleep, and so it kind of segments the conversation, but you know that they can hear what you're talking about. So you're having a conversation with somebody, but you know that anyone could be listening in at the same time, and so it creates this interesting scenario where you're like, what do I talk about? And obviously not trying to like talk bad about the person who's asleep necessarily, or maybe you do.
Maybe you do.
Maybe you do. But I think it results in these different breakthroughs in relationship because you can take advantage of that travel. And it's travel to me. It's the same thing with like manual labor. When you have to dig a hole together, whether you're on like a construction project or a trip or you're doing chores, the conversations that you have when you're pulling weeds or digging a hole or doing some kind of rote, more monotonous activity, I think it just really facilitates an interesting connection when you focus on the work for a while and then you stop and then you talk. And like I said, for some of you, you're like, I'm never going on a trip with Evan, and I'm definitely never doing any chores or work. But some of you understand what I'm talking about. I mean, it's these opportunities for connection. It's like, we're trapped together. What are we going to do to take advantage of this time anyways? Well, and we get some of that with Joel and Ellie.
We really do. We really do. And I think that this dichotomy between us really plays into their dynamic really, really well, because for Ellie and for you, it sounds like, man, every moment is part of the journey, and we're excited for the journey. We're excited for the connections, the things we're going to learn, and all that kind of stuff. For Joel and for myself, there's cargo and there's a destination, and the cargo are my passengers, and I've got to complete this thing. Okay, and that's just how it goes. I get it. What we see is Joel begins to break down in this episode. He even calls Ellie cargo at one point. Mm-hmm. But we begin to see this human connection that begins to emerge from this, that personalizes their relationship. So it's pretty well done and rooted in real world personalities, apparently.
Well, to your great joy, they arrive at their destination to some extent, and they get to Kansas City. So let's just talk about this part of the difference between the show and the game here, and that way we can kind of get it out of the way. So in the game, this is a couple of different things that are combined, but this all takes place in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. For the sake of the show, they have kind of moved it out west. So if you've played the game, and when you follow Wade on the lecture play that's going to come out tomorrow, you're going to see them, and this is going to take place in Pittsburgh. I don't think there's really too many major changes having shifted it to kind of a more western state. They're closer to where they need to be in the story of the show here. So just so you know, these events take place in a little different place, but they pull into Kansas City, and there's somebody standing in the street, and they're kind of asking some questions, but Joel's instincts kick in. Ellie, once again, caught on her heels a little bit. And what happens with Joel here?
Yeah, the guy's asking for some help, and Joel immediately goes into protection mode, kicks the car into high gear, and does not care. I mean, just going, because he knows it's an ambush. He's been in this world enough to know. And Ellie's taken by surprise. Like, are we not going to help him? He's like, absolutely not. We don't do that. And so and it ends up Joel's instinct was right, because other ambushers are coming out, and this was not a friendly thing.
So let's talk about the Olympic level athleticism that it would take to throw a cinder block from a fire escape to land on the windshield of the truck. I mean, he speeds up, and then somebody tosses a cinder block, and you see it falling because we're in a fixed camera position in the car. Yeah. And so you see the figure throw the cinder block, and it comes into frame, and then boom, spiderweb shatters kind of that windshield. And then they roll over some improvised tire spike strips there that look like some nails, and so the car kind of careens with flat tires, and Joel pulls into a shop, and they get into this gunfight. Ellie crawls through a hole in the wall. Joel is shooting back at them, and it seems that he's gotten one of the guys. There were two guys, and he's tagged when he's down. That guy's really angry, and a struggle ensues while Ellie is around the corner here. Tell us about the dynamics of this struggle and what it sets up here for our characters.
Well, they do a couple of really interesting things here that are just subtle. We don't need to delay the rest of the discussion for this, but there is subtle humanization of the attackers. And so when Joel hits one of the attackers, they start saying there's mourning, and it's like, no, that was my friend or whatever.
Right.
This is actually interesting just for the reason of The Last of Us Part 2 game does this regularly, where NPC characters have names, and it's this kind of idea of like, these are people. Right, and we want you to feel the weight of that a little bit. It's not anything crazy, but it's a unique call forward to The Last of Us Part 2, the game. But this particular scene, we learn a few things. Ellie's gone to hide. Joel is in now a fight, a fist fight, basically, with the guy, which feels really reminiscent of my playthrough, by the way.
You poor thing.
This episode is my Joel. if you've been watching the Lecture Play series, you know I've been having some capture card issues. And I have a 10 to 20 second sound delay. And so in this episode, we discover that Joel is functionally deaf in, I think, his right ear. And so he can't hear people sneaking up on him. And that's just like my Joel. As soon as the clicker is on me, as soon as I hear the clicker, it's too late in the game. And you will see me die and die and die. I think I died 21 times last night. But it's just one of those things. So in this particular scene, Joel is snuck up upon and he's in danger. And then Ellie, well, I guess her fantasy practice shooting comes in handy.
Yeah, you can see it. And so the angle of the shot, if I'm remembering it correctly, is pretty similar to what her practice moment or her imagination. At this point, then, she must perceive it somewhat like practice. I've been in this moment. I've imagined this moment. And so we get a similar framing on her face. Now, the thing that I will say is distinct and some great acting here by Bella is that the look of optimistic kind of yearning when she was practicing saying pew, 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 compared to the same framing of her face and the doubt and the concern and not really knowing what she wants to or is going to do here when she aims this gun. There is some hesitation there.
Yeah.
And Joel is actively being choked.
Yeah.
And so she decides to pull the trigger. And so she shoots. The guy falls off. Joel starts coughing very loudly. So there's this moment where Joel hasn't recovered, and there's this gap for this character to introduce his humanity. Talks about his name, talks about his family, says we can be friends now, starts offering gifts, right? He sees that the end is near. And then Joel tells Ellie to go back around the wall, and we assume he's going to finish off this attacker here. But there's this moment that you mentioned that for Ellie, this is a transition here where it feels like, okay, this may be the first person that she's killed or shot. Definitely the first person that she shot, right? We know that she hasn't really had much experience with a gun. So this is kind of a big moment for her character. And more than that, there's a perception that Joel has of how she's feeling right now that you pointed out. Tell us about that.
You know, it's interesting because from an audience standpoint, we think, kind of like Joel, that Ellie, this is a pretty shocking sort of thing. Ellie's killing somebody, or Ellie shot somebody at this point. And Joel, you know, is very careful and sends her away. And he is projecting onto Ellie his own relationship with his daughter, Sarah, because he's immediately thinking, if Sarah had done this kind of thing, how would that fundamentally change her perspective? And so Ellie doesn't need to see this. Ellie doesn't need to be the one to do this. I'm going to do that because I'm already broken. I'm already kind of grizzled by the world. And so I'm going to protect her. But Ellie announces that this isn't the first time. And we for us, the audience, this isn't just a character development sort of thing. This is a character revelation for us. It's like, oh, she's got a backstory that we really don't know. Yeah. And so if we've been projecting Sarah onto Ellie, then we need to be careful not to do that.
It's a big difference because right when you get into this kind of tenderness, it's a familiar territory for us in a non-apocalyptic existence. Yeah. Then it's another one of those subversions where you're reminded of the grim realities of the world. But I think it also alludes to the fact that there's and we don't have to stay on this a ton, but I think it also alludes to the fact that there's what we perceive someone's lived experience to be and the reality of their lived experience. And the assumptions that we make about what someone has been through and what they think. Tell us a little bit about how you've seen this lived out. I think especially in the classroom environment where you have people who don't know each other who then have to quickly get together and kind of share some deep vulnerabilities while they're learning together. You facilitate this well. Tell me about it.
We talk about this a lot in my classes, and one of the things, there's a great TED Talk that's called The Danger of a Single Story. The Danger of a Single Story. And this, I'm forgetting the name of the presenter, but she is telling her story about the way that she's been stereotyped throughout years. But one statement kind of rings incredibly true. Said the problem with stereotypes is not that they are necessarily untrue, but they are incomplete. And whenever there's a gap in knowledge, we fantasize or fictionalize to like build in the gaps.
Yeah.
And that's what we do in our interpersonal relationships as well. We see someone and we have an archetype in our mind for what that type of person is, and we come up with their backstory. And so we begin to project that onto people. And so the way, we talk about this again and again on this show, proximity is going to produce empathy because you're getting to know the real person. Something else that I also have begun to say ever since our Final Fantasy VII Rebirth lecture series, our interview with Tyler Hepner, when he said, paint what you see, not what you know, or draw what you see, not what you know. I think that that's something that we tend to do all the time. That's what Joel's doing with Ellie here. He's drawing Ellie as what he knows, not necessarily who she is and what he sees. That's such a huge dynamic that he's overcoming.
What a great callback. And that's a great interview if anybody wants to go back and listen to it. Tyler's remarkably talented and was very kind to give us that time. So shout out Tyler if you're out there listening. Thanks for the interview. So we then move on and we meet another major player in this story that's going to kind of walk with us through at least the next couple episodes. And I think it's a little unclear how they're going to use it in the future as well. Yeah. So I'm interested to see if and when and how they resolve some of this. We meet Kathleen. So Kathleen is the leader of some sort of society or group, but we don't know that kind of right away. Our first introduction to Kathleen is in this one-on-one scenario where it becomes very apparent very quickly that she has a lot of power over someone, maybe in her custody per se. And so they have this conversation. And when they have this conversation, we find out that these people have a lot of history together, but Kathleen is looking for something. Tell us about the connection that Kathleen has with this individual and what this conversation reveals to her as we start to build out her character and the world that has happened in Kansas City.
Kathleen is looking for a guy named Henry, who is kind of this criminal that she's after, at least in her mind, because of the crimes that we will learn more about in the upcoming episodes. But Kathleen, by the way, played by the fantastic Melanie Linsky, we should say, she is not a character in the game, but she represents kind of the personification of multiple different groups, riot groups, resistance to Fedra groups that have overthrown their reign. And one of the things that we talk about in our lecture plays, shout out to our research assistants, we've been reading through some Aristotle and Aristotle's ideal society and what's known as a Greek polis or city-state and the way that it's governed. And essentially what Aristotle talks about is that those that are in leadership are going to look after the human flourishing, the state of good for the people that they are ruling over. Now here, Kathleen is leading as someone who's really trying to pursue her own good, her own revenge satisfaction. But she's dressing it up in a way that makes it seem like she's doing it for everybody. But really, this is a self sort of leadership sort of thing. It's interesting. It may have started out differently, but that's kind of what it's evolved into.
Yeah, I want to talk about the dialogue that happens between this person in custody and Kathleen, because the writing here is really great. It's very efficient, and it creates enough mystery while revealing enough other parts that if you pay attention, you feel pretty clearly like you know a little bit about Kathleen and what she's willing and capable of, because one of our themes that we explore throughout the show is what is blank person capable of? What are we capable of as individuals? And so Kathleen jumps right into this here. And so they have this conversation that is pretty intimate. We find out that they've known each other for a long time. The guy says, I delivered you as a child. So then we find out that the doctor, that this person has a lot of utility in a post-apocalyptic society, that this could be a really valuable skill set and knowledge to have, but that Kathleen feels so betrayed, and she starts listing off these names. And then we find out about her brother, and it's really pretty short conversation that happens, but we know everything that we need to know to make us just curious enough about Kathleen and what's been happening in Kansas City. And so we go outside, and Kathleen is talking to her crew. And that's kind of the first time we meet the broader group in Kansas City. We begin to realize that they are more of a resistance group, that they aren't Fedra, that they've been opposing Fedra, that things have been going down, and that something recently has kind of, for lack of a better term, popped off in Kansas City as they finally made this big push to kind of expunge Fedra. So something happened that kind of lit this powder keg in their area. And so Kathleen brings this broader conversation to her group. There's a character that we're going to interact with a little bit more, but it's kind of her right-hand man. He seems like a special ops, really experienced military guy, or at least he portrays himself that way. And his name is Perry. Yeah. So Perry is going to serve as this kind of reminder of maybe what Kathleen has been up to this point, and we'll start to realize that Kathleen has had a bit of a departure from maybe who she's been as a leader in the past. So as we examine Kathleen's leadership, there's a conversation that happens when they bring the two bodies that Joel killed. They say, hey, listen, these were outsiders. You know, one of them is still clinging to life, but it's not looking good. What do we learn about Kathleen and her leadership from this interaction while this kind of these people try to figure out what happened to their friends who were killed, who were these attackers that got Joel and Ellie to crash into this storefront?
Yeah, I mean, she wants to know who it is, and it's clear that it is outsiders. And so there is this insider-outsider mentality to securing their state of things. It's a really interesting foil to what we see with breaching self-sufficiency themes in episode 3 with Bill and Frank. And so here we have this very isolated, walled off sort of thing. We should also note that, just really interesting side piece, Perry, played by Jeffrey Pierce, was the voice of Joel's brother Tommy in the video game. And so it's an interesting kind of callback here. But Perry serves as this second in command, and in a lot of ways serves as a foil to Kathleen. And we'll certainly see that in this episode and in the next. But I think that their dynamic is really interesting from a leadership standpoint, because Kathleen is like I said, she's just kind of on this like hunting utilitarian vengeance tour, right?
She has tunnel vision. It seems like she
and nobody can break through it.
She has this clarity of purpose, and we find out that it's revenge. So we haven't gotten to experience a ton of the revenge narrative that exists in The Last of Us at this point in the show. But this is probably our first major introduction to this idea of when we experience loss and we have pain, what are we going to do? What are we going to do to make it right? What do we want to do to restore that feeling, or at least evoke and distribute some punishment potentially to people who have harmed us? So Kathleen's got some focus. And as they go back and forth a little bit, we start to realize that Kathleen is pretty singularly minded. Yeah. And so she asks, hey, would having a doctor help with this person who's bleeding out? And she asks it very matter-of-factly, kind of plain tone, and they say, no, he's gone. And what does she do? She marches right back into that holding cell, and she just, we assume, shoots the doctor because she said, this is it. There's no more utility. I don't need you anymore. And so it's a very utilitarian approach to that. Her revenge overwhelms the utility.
You with us?
I'm here.
Okay.
The revenge overwhelms the utility of her need for the doctor. And so when that happens, she was ready, and it was like her finger was on the trigger the whole time. And that, I don't need you anymore. Now I can do what I want here. So that's a big window into a lot of the aspects, I think, of her character. So then she says, hey, listen, we're going to round everybody up. So what do you think is important to know about Kathleen as they start looking for this Henry person? And she kind of galvanizes everybody, and they roll out in this kind of Mad Max style with these vehicles and garbage trucks with like snowplow things on the front. It's a pretty wild scene. What do we need to know about Kathleen in this society as we kind of transition into this manhunt scenario?
She strikes me, and I remember the first time I saw this episode, she struck me then, as she does now, as just a hollow leader.
Yeah.
She's somebody that is all bark, and she probably does have a bite, but it's not warranted. She is singularly focused. She's leading out of her own emotions and for her own satisfaction, and it's that tunnel vision. And there's clues here that that's going to be her downfall. And I just remember being delighted over that. I was like, let's exploit that weakness. So.
She's an opponent to get past for you then. Well, there's a scene where she and Perry are clearing a building, and we see a little bit of Kansas City and kind of get an idea that this is a very lived in and a very recent conflict. They open this door in this building, and they see essentially a horde. They recognize that there's a horde that's developed somewhere in the city somewhere. So we get the sense that this is definitely something that they're going to have to deal with at some point. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And Perry seems to want to be more proactive in addressing it, and Kathleen insists that they move on and that they can deal with it later. She kind of hits the snooze button here. You're not a big alarm snoozer, so I imagine that bothers you a little bit. But what do we know about Kathleen here and her and Perry's relationship?
From a leadership standpoint, yeah, I mean, that she does hit the snooze button, and there are times to do that, and then there's always consequences when you do it, right? But there's no good reason, I would say, that she doesn't say, yeah, we need to handle that. And a good leader is going to be like, okay, some of you go handle this, and like, I'm going to give my attention over here. But in her tunnel vision, utilitarian focus, that is, it does not matter, because it's not really about the safety of the community. It's about the satisfaction of her own ire. And so, I mean, that is just another clue to this sort of, this is the downfall of a single-minded leader that's not looking into the whole community. And again, Aristotle would argue against her here. But again, practical leadership would also do the same.
Let's talk about practical leadership for just a couple minutes here. So when it comes to your feelings and perceptions of something as a leader, when you find yourself in a situation, whether it's family, social situation, professional, maybe a sports team, you're going to have personal preferences, right? And good leadership is not just the abandonment of personal preferences. I think in a lot of ways it's understanding what they are and then understanding what your leadership style is and what the context determines. Now, that's very nuanced and not quite as easy to just apply across the board. But how do you encourage folks to start understanding themselves and the whole as they examine and develop leaders? Because you develop a lot of leaders in the college sphere. These are people who are high achievers. It's not easy to get into the University of Alabama. You have some very smart, very driven students. And so they're relying on you to have those kind of outside conversations about leadership and life and how they take care of people. How do you balance that individual responsibility and passion with the need for kind of the common good and organizational goals? Where do you tell people to start when they encounter different situations like that?
Well, what I tell them often, especially in this scenario, is don't get ahead of yourself. Be diligent and, to use another phrase, be disciplined and faithful in what you have today, and also have a mindset for the future as well. But if all you're doing is future thinking, like I'm going to be a doctor one day, you're never going to be a doctor, because you've got to determine your direction before you determine I'm at my destination. Like you have to go in the right direction in order to get to that destination. Otherwise, you're never going to get there. Good intentions just don't do it. And so what I say to my students is, what is on your plate today? And if it's, and then prioritize it. And so I'll give you a real world example. Yesterday, I go into the office, and I'm also in some ways in charge of the entire building that I work in. And so, we had these two toilets in the women's room that are just like a nightmare scenario for me, because it's like we never have enough money, and then we also like just need to have these things fixed. And so I bring out these plumbers and stuff, and they're working on all of this. And through a series of let me go in and make sure that we're all settled and all of these things, and we can pay the plumbers and all this stuff, I noticed a few kind of weird things about some of the finances. Nothing major, just something that I need to look into. That to me was my bloaters at the gravel moment. Okay, and there is a temptation for me to say we're not worrying about that today. But I began to really kind of fix up some structures and say, okay, that could be a problem in like a month or 2 months or something like that. But I need to figure that out today so that's not going to come up later. Meanwhile, my bathrooms are exploding because the plumbers found a lot of issues. And it's like, it was a doomsday scenario at my office is what I'm saying. It's about my week.
Well, I mean, I can imagine you slowly peeking that bathroom door open, and then, it wasn't a bloater, which we'll come to meet later.
Which I didn't hear for 20 seconds because of the sound delay.
But it was an ever-circling vortex of toilet water that would not
It really
shut
was.
off.
It was a doomsday scenario. But I share that illustration simply because this is where I take a lot of I take a lot of offense at what Kathleen does as a leader here, because a leader is going to be looking at the whole picture and focusing on the details simultaneously and knowing when to pivot that focus. And that's what a good leader is always going to do. You have an eye for today and an eye for tomorrow simultaneously. She has tunnel vision.
There's one last piece of that I'd love for us to button up before we step into this last scene, and it's the communication piece with the group. So Kathleen obviously has, you would say, a bit of a moral and ethical responsibility to be a good leader and not push snooze too much on something that would be big and take the time to investigate. But also there's a communication piece that she has with, it's illustrated with her conversation with Perry, is that she has somebody that for all intents and purposes, should be very trustworthy and should have her ear, who is reminding her of some of the values and things that got them here that are successful that she might be abandoning. What do you do when it comes to communicating back with people? Because we typically don't encounter these scenarios alone. Leadership of ourselves only goes so far. Leadership implies that there's groups involved, right? So what does it do for the group when we don't communicate well, when we abandon our values, and how far can you stretch that rubber band, as we'll see here in the next episode with Kathleen?
You're a Georgia Bulldogs fan, right? And Kirby Smart is known for getting really, really excited on the sidelines. He used to be at Alabama. He did the same thing there. And I think it's brilliant that Kirby has assigned one assistant to be his pullback guy.
Yeah, we call him his get-back guy.
His get-back guy. He runs in there and grabs Kirby and pulls him back. So there's not...
Actually holds him by the belt like a
Holds
harness.
him by the belt like a harness, right? And it's such a smart thing. That's the guy that every leader needs to have. And your get-back guy is your values guy. That's like, hey, don't jump out there because you're going to get flagged, all right? Because you're stepping out of what brought you here in the first place. And so... just having somebody to bring you back. And if you don't have a person for that, you've got to find some way for reflection and self-awareness to get back into your lane so that you can be the leader and not the reactionary that you're tempted to be.
That's great. There's only two things that I'll add to that. First one is go dogs. The second one is that when you have that person... we don't have time to talk about this.
No.
There's a layer of communication and forgiveness that needs to be necessary there, because you're asking them to force you to do something that you're naturally not going to do. So I've worked with a ton of leaders in the past who request that level of impact and influence, and they want to be like, listen, if I go too far here, try and pull me back. But then all the ire that was directed the opposite direction, the second that you try to pull on the belt, they turn around and they deliver it to you. So if you are thinking, I am a leader in those scenarios, I would encourage you to think long and hard about the nature of your communications and the relationship that forgiveness and apologizing has in those relationships. Because the deeper you want to go and the further you want to go, you're also going to have to increase the depth and capacity for your communication and your forgiveness. Anyways.
Isn't that the truth? Gosh, so good.
So as we continue
Thanks, Kathleen, for this leadership moment, by the way.
Leadership moments with Kathleen. All right. Anyways, I'll work on the jingle. So
can you imagine? Like, it would be like a fail forward podcast, like life lessons from Kathleen and what not to do.
Yeah. How not to let the bloat in your life get just closed into the closet. It's perfect.
I love it.
So we get, as we always do, or for the most part, we get our bookend to the scene. The show opened with Ellie and some jokes in the car, and the show ends with Ellie and Joel finding the safe place to rest. Joel breaks the window and spreads the glass around and says, "This is so we can hear someone sneaking up on us." Ellie says, "You would never hear them anyways." And then Ellie tells some jokes, and we get this genuine moment of tenderness. It's a difference in the response to what has been given before. Talk us through what makes this scene so special.
Well, Joel laughs. You know, I mean, you don't see a lighthearted Joel, especially outside of the prologue. This is the first time that he's really smiled and laughed since he's been with Sarah. And so, again, that sort of projection is starting to creep up. And it kind of lets us know that Joel is seeing Ellie as less cargo and more maybe daughter material, which is interesting. Certainly a projection of his own daughter's relationship with him.
Yeah, there's a psychological concept of transference that I think is important here, because this is the first time that we see it majorly overtly, because it's cracked Joel's shell. So if we look at the way that shell has been cracked as we've gone along, it's in, I don't want to even be responsible for the cargo, to, okay, this is just cargo, but Tess is pulling him through, to now he's been given this charge and this mandate that has transferred from Tess to Ellie, from Bill, and now the culmination of 3 episodes of that kind of whittling away, and almost, I would say it's really more of an erosion.
Yeah.
And then once that shell is weakened, then those cracks start to form.
Oh, man.
But his resistance to that and the callousness that he's put up has eroded. And so there's a tenderness that, you're right, we haven't seen since the very beginning of this show. But there is that start of that concept of transference. Now, we're going to talk more about transference in further episodes, so I don't think it's a concept that we need to fully explore. But I do want to bring it up because it's important to note that transference isn't something that just happens instantly. Transference is something that happens over time, and we become aware of it in specific moments, but it's a long process, and I think this show does a good job illustrating that. What's important about that laughter and their relationship at this point, and when they wake up, things aren't great. So it's a little bit of a scary moment that this episode ends on. But talk to us about the importance of that tenderness.
I mean, it's important for their own character development, but I also think that it's important because Joel lets his guard down, and immediately in the next scene, they're at gunpoint. Yeah,
so that we find this kind of slow wake-up scene, and then there is a child that says nothing. That is standing over them, and they are at gunpoint, and it's the end of the episode. Shorter episode compared to some other ones. Yeah, caught me a little off guard watching it week to week. Felt, I think you said it's not quite a whole meal.
It's not a whole meal. It didn't feel like a whole meal. It's also an open-ended sort of thing. It's a story that doesn't really have a conclusion at the end of the episode, like the other 3 did.
And I don't think it needs to necessarily, but it was a little jarring narratively. But it is a TV show, and they gave us so much resolution at the end of every episode. It seemed like they were maybe a little bit torn between making this one really big, long episode or not. And so no big deal there. So
also, you talk about bookends a lot, and to start with Ellie practicing the gun and then to have another child holding the gun at the end is a really interesting bookend.
Didn't even think about it.
It's crazy.
Amazing. It is a really similar scene. You know, the only thing would be the angle, but I don't want to like the camera angle and the way that we do it. But it was also really, really dark. So if you watch this episode in particular on an older television, there's a good chance you're not seeing much.
Oh yeah, isn't that the truth?
You got to watch it. You got to watch it at night on the nicest TV that you have. So as we kind of end this episode, we have a lot of unresolved tension that is more than what we've had before. So what are you left with to think about in between this? Assuming that we're not watching them back to back and that you had a week or two to think about it, what are the lingering questions that you would want to be aware of going into the next episode?
I mean, for me, I think that our conversation is really centered on this idea of leadership. And we've seen so many different types of survivalists in this culture. You've got Bill, certainly, and Frank, and the self-sufficiency. You've got this cargo smuggler provider in Joel who's now softening. And is that really the best? Should he be a little bit more like Bill and Frank were, or should he be this hard, grizzled sort of person? And then you've got this tunnel vision, utilitarian only Kathleen. And so moving forward, it's a really interesting sort of dynamic to see what lessons will Joel take from this as he's trying to complete his goal of bringing Ellie over to the Fireflies.
Well, knowing where we're heading everything that this episode does to stretch the rubber band and create tension, they strap a rocket ship to it, and it snaps back tenfold in these future episodes. So I'm looking forward to getting into these next one. Thank you for your thoughts and your time, and thanks for listening, everybody.
Absolutely. We'll be back next week with episode 5. And in the meantime, you can check out our lecture play on Tuesday night, as well as a brand new expert interview with Dr. Gleason, who is a biomedical ethicist, who will be talking about all of the ins and outs of what's the ethics of Joel's choices and everything that we do in this game and in this story. Until next time, everybody, remember this: when you are lost in the darkness, look for the light. We'll see you next time.
Bye everyone. Thanks to Husky by the Geek for our theme music. Thanks to Nick Smith for our graphics. And most of all, thanks to you. This program is brought to you by viewers like you, and we really appreciate you. We look forward to seeing you on our next episode. Bye-bye.